Hey there! Welcome to another episode of Code Hour. My name is Lee Richardson, and this is episode 23, I believe, and I'm going to give an overview of how to access stored procedures from ASP.NET Core site, and specifically how to do it in an ASP.NET Boilerplate project. And if you are unfamiliar with ASP.NET Boilerplate, I recommend you go check out episode number 19 on my YouTube channel, which is now my most popular video, so that's a great place to get started. Now, one of the people that viewed that commented and said that they thought that I should do an overview of how to access stored procedures. Now, that is actually documented on ASP.NET Boilerplate's website, and their documentation is fantastic. And so I highly recommend you check this out. But potentially what it's missing is how to get the stored procedures into the database to begin with using Entity Framework Code First migrations. So that's not really covered. And then it's kind of missing maybe just a sort of an overview of the process from beginning to end. And so hopefully this video will help with both of those fronts. So in the last video, I built this site, LeeStore. I just generated it and made a couple customizations. And this is what a blank ASP.NET Boilerplate site gives you. And I put together a simple products page. And so what I thought I would do in this episode is to make an action under here, besides edit and delete, something like maybe setting the product quantity, like maybe restock. So I had like a restock button, and you click that and it's going to change the quantity to something. Now in the back end, it's going to hit a stored procedure, and that stored procedure is going to calculate what an ideal quantity is for a restock. I don't know, it's not a great example, but you know, something like that. It'll give an overview of the process. So when I'm coding up ASP.NET Boilerplate, or I don't know, I guess front-end, back-end work in general, what I like to do is I'll do a really light work on the back-end, on the C# side of things, and then I'll generate the proxy, and the proxy will now enable me to code up some work on the front end, and then I can have the front end call the back end and kind of do a beginning to end process where the front end's hitting the back end and everything looks good, but the back end's not really fully implemented. So then I'll go in and implement the back end. So that's what I'm going to do right now, and plus that'll keep my demos a little bit shorter, and it won't be like long swaths of me coding. Fortunately, I'll be able to edit that and fix that up in post-editing, so you don't have to watch all of the boring coding. All right, enough talking. Let's get going. So first things first, I'm going to write a little bit of code in the back end. This is my C# code here, and inside of I've got a products app service, and so I'm going to write a new method here, which is going to enable me to public, let's do void for right now, and we'll say that this is, actually it should probably be a task, and we're going to say this is restock. Okay, there we go. Took a little longer than I thought it would. Okay, so this is just a restock function, and all it does right now is just update the quantity. It does a quantity equals quantity plus 1, and now I ought to be able to regenerate the swagger via nswagger. And so to do that, I've covered that in the previous presentation, but I'm going to cd nswag and refresh.bat. And the chances are good if I go over into source tree here that I should see service proxies has been updated with a restock function. Very nice. So to get that service proxy, then I'm going to go into my products components, and actually there's a good chance that it's already here because I was using it for something else. Yeah, there we go. We've got a product service already, and so now I can create a little method here, public. Hey, and there's the restock method on there, which takes a product ID. And that's just a little shortcut there. I could .subscribe and put in a lambda and then have it call refresh, or a little shortcut here is I could just pass in the refresh function. If I were just to pass in the refresh function, however, this method would be bound to the wrong thing. So if I do this.refresh.bind to this, and that re-updates the context in JavaScript to have this point to the same thing that this is. So, anyway, that should work. And then on the front end here, I'm going to jump over to the HTML. By the way, that keyboard shortcut in Visual Studio Code is Control-Shift-E, which I always use to sort of jump back and forth between the TypeScript and the HTML file. So there's a little keyboard shortcut that might or might not help you. And so let's put it right next to the delete function. And so this is going to be called, and that's going to call product.id, I guess. That'll work. And I don't know if we really have a matte icon. We could use the edit again. And I'm going to be bad at not doing any localization, and we'll just call this RESTOCK restock. And if I Control-Shift-S, then this should be recompiling. There we go, that's recompiling. And if I jump back over to the front end, that's refreshed itself. I've got a button here. I've got a button called Restock. If I hit that, this might go up to 8. Oh, that actually worked. Didn't expect that to work. All right, fantastic. So now it's time to actually get into the nuts and bolts of this. And to implement that, we need to implement a new store. We need to bring in a new store procedure. So hopefully you've been patient and waited through to this point. Now, to get that to work, we need to create a new data migration. And so that would be something that we're going to do in the Entity Framework core. And so we should end up with another migration that looks like this, except it's going to add our store procedure. So jump on over to the Package Manager console. And very important to always remember to set the default project here. We're going to set the default project to Entity Framework core. Can't tell you how many times I've forgot to do that. And then we're going to do an add migration called Okay, and here we are with a new migration. So now the trick is we need to update the database, and so we could do, there's actually nothing unfortunately built in Entity Framework core to say add a store procedure. There's no sprock or store procedure or whatever, but what we can do is just execute raw SQL with like a create procedure. To do that, I might just open up Visual Studio or SQL Server Integration Services. And so I got my SQL Server Management Studio here, and I'm just going to steal the code. I'm going to create a store procedure in there to get the syntax right. Okay, well, this gives us a lot more stuff than is really necessary. Create procedure, that'll work, and we can call this something like get restock quantity, something like that, and we will need a parameter, and that's important to show how to do parameters. So this will be okay, I think that looks good. If I execute this just to test it, I hope you won't blame me, and then I'll go in and blow it away. So the code looks like that. I'm going to execute it. Get restock quantity. Excellent. So that actually worked. And now the trick is to get it to work from here so that everyone can reproduce this on their own machines, the other developers, the production database, the dev database, the test database, and all that. And so we could just like plunk all that code in here like that or something like that, I guess. But I don't know. That just feels a little bit messy. So I think what's a little bit nicer is if you have, maybe you have a whole folder for all your store procedures. If you're doing more than one, and you know, you shouldn't be doing too much because this is, of course, the benefit of Entity Framework. But there are times when store procedures give you a lot of performance, and so they're not to be completely ignored. And what's nice about putting this into a separate file is you get nice color coding and all of that inside of Visual Studio. Whew. I don't know, is that a little better? Okay, and so for my next trick, I need to get access to that, and because migrations are just C# code, I can do the things that I might normally do, such as set a build action of embedded resource and access that embedded resource the way, oh, you know, one does. And so we could imagine having maybe a public class like store procedure helper. Oh, actually, we can do better than that. We can do assembly dot reflection dot get executing assembly dot get manifest resource stream. And as you know, getting other files is a matter of making sure the namespace is correct. And so the namespace, the default namespace here is probably leastore.entity framework core. Yes, sure is. Oh, no, wait. Default namespace is just leastore. Interesting. Okay. So this should be leastore dot store procedures, the name of that folder, and then the name of that file. Oops. Dot plus file name. And we should really be good citizens and do a using statement so that it will close off when we're done. Now that just gets the manifest resource stream. We need to convert it into a text stream. This is called get restock quantity.sql. So ideally that will return, if that's working the way we expect it to, then that should return the sprock itself, the contents of that file, and then the contents of that file we want to execute it, and that should be enough to make it go up, and then to make it go back down, and we should probably have a migration builder. This is a little bit incongruous. I don't like the lack of it doesn't feel balanced. Like this doesn't have the name of a store procedure, and this does have the name of a store procedure. Yeah, I don't know how that's going to work. Oh, so what would be a better way to do this is to have maybe our store procedure helper could also do a get. It could also do a drop, maybe using the name of the file or something like that. That's how I did that in production, but this will be good enough for now. Let's try running it. Oops, I forgot the name of the command. It's should be upgrade database. Oh, it's update database. There we go. One of those commands. Oh, it actually worked. Well, it didn't fail anyway. So if this actually did work, we ought to be able to refresh the list of store procedures here and see that, yeah, there we go. Get restock quantity. It is actually there. Now the trick to get this to execute is, well, okay, so we've sort of completed two major phases of this. The first phase is to have the front end call in the back end. The second phase is to get the store procedure into the database, and the third phase will be to execute the store procedure from inside of our app service. And so the way they recommend doing that in the documentation, and I like this too, is to customize the repository to put the store procedure as a method onto the repository itself. And the nice thing about doing that, and the reason that they do that, is because that way you can abstract out the details of how the execution of the store procedure works, and you can unit test it separately. So the implementation is separate from the fact that you called the store procedure. So to do that, we need, I guess what we're trying to do here is, once we've gotten our product, we're trying to do something like product dot get restock quantity, or actually I guess actually what we're trying to do is repository dot there we go. Okay, and then we want to set the quantity to the restock quantity. By the way, notice that I didn't need to call I think it would be more polite if I were to say repository.update async product, but it does close that and do that for us automatically by default. Okay, that's a little tidier. It actually technically isn't needed. Okay. The get restock quantity method, however, doesn't exist on the current repository, and so we need to do a custom repository, because right now this repository, this iRepository of product int, it's just created dynamically at runtime using magic. So we need to do our own version of that. And so to do that, we want to put it inside of the migrator. Oh, sorry, Entity Framework Core. Entity Framework Core is where it should be. And if we look in Entity Framework Core repositories, here we go. Here's a repository base. And so if we're going to customize repositories, we want to have them inherit from this repository base. So let's do that with something like a public, and we're going to have this be a product repository. Okay, that's a good start. I'm going to move this into its own class, into its own file. So that's a little tidier. And now we, instead of asking for an iProduct repository, oh, actually we do want this to implement, and that's the base class, and then it's an iProduct repository. Okay, there we go. That looks good. And we're going to, well, just for right now, let's do things in small chunks. In our products app service, we were hoping to get a get restock quantity, which takes okay, last but not least, we need an iProduct repository. So this is the concrete class, and we need an interface. And that interface, a good place to put that is in core, so that it's available everywhere. Okay, all right, there we go. That took a little bit more work than I thought it was going to be. I got the access modifier wrong. So the iProduct repository does need to be public. Okay, so I created, just to summarize this again, I created an interface in the core project, which is the thing that everybody has access to the core, so that's a great place to put interfaces. And so the interface exists there in core, and it says, I inherit from an iRepository of product int, which was the thing that we had been using that was that was generated dynamically. And then we've got a custom method here called get restock quantity, and that lives inside of the entity framework core repositories. And here it is saying that I implement an iProduct repository, and my concrete class, base class, is the lead store repository base, which is where it gets all of its functionality from. And now the only thing we need, the only thing we need to do to get this next section of the phase of this project working is inside of here. We need, instead of using an iRepository, we're going to use our iProduct repository, which is going to behave nearly identically. It's just it has one new piece of information on it. And if I were to run this right now, it ought to return 17. Right? Let's try it. I'm going to compile There we go, compiled. By the way, there's a little trick for you. When I do this, when I use ASP.NET Boilerplate in production, one thing that I like to do all the time is, instead of hitting F5, which takes a long time on my, I've got 16 gigs of memory or whatever, so it's not terrible, but it does take a little longer if you hit F5 to run the whole thing and start it up. And then it opens up a new process in Chrome or whatever your default browser is, and then whenever you stop it, it shuts down that whole process, and if you have any tabs in there, it takes those out with it. It's kind of annoying. So what I do most of the time when I'm coding is I find myself just hitting Control F5, or the equivalent here is debug, start without debugging. Start without debugging. So that's the trick I use there. And now, if I go back to my store here, if I run Restock, it's going to go up to 17, right? Hey, wow! Man, I love it when stuff works. Okay, so the next thing we got to do is, and really all we did was just hard code 17, but now we've got all of the different bits and pieces into place where we can actually call the store procedure. And so I can go back over to my product repository. There it is, and here I want to call the actual store procedure. Now, there are 3 different ways to call a store procedure, and it depends on what you're doing, which one you want to do. So if you're doing something which returns an entity, like if I had something that returns products, that's the simplest one to do. And then another, well, let's do that first. Okay, there we go. That's one way we could do it. That's one way to execute store procedures. And so this is saying, okay, on the context object, I'm going to return products, and I'm going to use it with this SQL statement. Get restock quantity executes the store procedure, and then a list of the parameters. At product ID says I'm going to parameterize this, and this is the value of that parameter. So you can see that if I were to extract that into a parameter right now, it's wanting to be an iQueryable of product. So that is great. That's one way to do it. However, that's not what we're doing because we didn't select star from product. Another way to execute store procedures it is. Okay, option 2 is if it doesn't return anything at all, it's just a pure side effecting function, which isn't pure, but you know what I mean. If it's just launching the missiles, if it's just doing that, then execute a SQL command. Async will work nicely. You run that off of the context.database, and you can the name of the store procedure, the parameter, and then what the value of the parameter is. We're also not doing that, so we get to do the most complicated option, because, yeah, might as well show the most complicated option, and that is if it returns arbitrary data. So this one is going to require a lot more code, and it's the example that they give over here again in the documentation. Well, they give all 3, but actually maybe they don't give all 3. No, they don't give all 3. All they give is this more complicated option that I'm going to give. So okay, here we go. Ooh, okay. That was a lot of coding. This is a old school way of getting access to databases, where you use a command And then after you've created the command, which is the thing that you execute, you set the command text, which is the name of the store procedure, and the parameter. Again, don't use string concatenation. That's how you introduce SQL injection errors, because then if you haven't sanitized your database inputs, then people can put in bad stuff to execute. So again, always use the @prod. I know it seems like a lot of code, but it's worth it. It makes things work, perhaps, if performance is really important to you. You say it's a store procedure, and then you have there's your parameter. You provide the value. You say, hey, this product ID's value is equal to this. Whew, that's a lot of coding there. And then you have to execute the reader. So you execute the reader, which opens a connection into it, and you can loop over all of the results. And so while read returns a true or a false, if it's a true, if there's more records, then it'll keep going. We're really only interested in the first one, so we can just do a quick return, but this shows how to do it. Now, the only thing that is not working here is setting the transaction, and this I wish it wasn't necessary, but it is necessary. You have to set the transaction onto the current command in order for it to know to hook into the current transaction. So you have to be able to get the ambient transaction from inside of ASP.NET Boilerplate, and this is a reusable function you might use elsewhere. So, but for now, I'm just going to do a one-off version of the get transaction. I need a transaction provider, which I can get via dependency injection up here. So this will be like an iActive transaction provider. Go. Now we've got an active transaction provider, and to get the transaction from the transaction provider, we have to get active transaction. And at this point, I think we're just getting into pure magic. So I'm just going to pull these values directly down from the documentation. Okay, ooh, there we go. All right, can't say I entirely understand what all that is, because, you know, I'm not that deeply familiar with the innards, but there we go. That should do what we need. Oh, I should, it's complaining at me now because there's a return statement missing if this didn't return anything. So how about we just throw an exception for now? Okay, well, that looks like it compiles. This might actually work. So I'm going to try compiling it and running it, and we'll see. If this works, what we would expect to see is the store procedure was returning a 1-up of the current product ID. So it's currently 17. So if I execute it on the front end now, we should see it go up to 18. And if that works, then we have successfully introduced a store procedure and executed it through a custom repository. Okay, well, an error occurred. Let's take a look inside the logs. Oh, okay, well, here we go. By the way, when errors do occur, I highly recommend you keep a tail on the logs.txt. I mentioned this in the previous video, but this is where you can actually find the contents of the error messages. And so what this didn't like was it said, cannot find store procedure, restock quantity with an @product ID. I'm pretty sure I need to remove the @product ID out of here and allow just the SQL parameter to do its job. Woo! Fantastic. Ah, that is great. Okay, so what we just got to see was that we introduced a new entity framework migration, and inside of that entity framework migration, we created that store procedure into the database, and then after creating the database, we customized an repository, made our own custom repository, and we called a new store procedure into that, and now it is actually working, and everything is good. So I hope that was helpful for you. If you need the details, definitely head on over to the documentation here. Also, I've published this up into GitHub, so there's some sample code that I was showing here, and hope you've learned something, and have a wonderful next week. And don't hesitate to like and subscribe if this was helpful. So great, thank you very much. Goodbye. Find the end button.